Hello and welcome to Geopolitics Decanted. This is Dmitri Alperovitch. I'm chairman of Silverado Policy Accelerator, a geopolitics think tank in Washington, D.C. Today my guest is Franz-Stefan Gady, a research fellow at IISS think tank in London, where he's focused on the future of conflict and war. I want to apologize in advance to you, as when we were recording this session with Franz-Stefan this week, we ran into some technical difficulties and the audio quality unfortunately did not turn out to be as stellar as the content. Please accept my deep apologies, and I hope you can still enjoy this episode. Here it is. Welcome, Franz-Stefan.
Thank you for having me, Dmitri.
Absolutely. So let's start first with your trip. You recently took a trip with Mike Kaufman and Ryan Evans and Konrad Muzyka to Ukraine. What are your impressions from the trip? What surprised you? What are the things you learned from there?
I guess one of the most surprising aspects of this trip was when we took a trip, a battlefield tour, so to speak, around Kiev, trying to figure out what was really going on in the first couple of days of the war. And the conclusion became that it was a very close run thing, and much closer than I think a lot of people would suspect in the first couple of days of this war, to what degree the Ukrainians were really able to fight off the Russians, and how decentralized this was really the effort to beat back the Russians, and how many volunteers were used in this effort, and how many casualties were actually incurred on both sides in this conflict. This probably was one of the more interesting aspects of this trip. Also, I think what I found very interesting is also, and this goes into an article that I recently have published also in Foreign Policy magazine, that is the highly decentralized nature of the Ukrainian way of war, so to speak, and this ad hoc approach, this bottom-up adaptation that is really prevalent in the Ukrainian armed forces, which often does not strike me as being particularly well coordinated between units. And I think one of the lessons from this trip is that it's very hard to actually make some general observations. It really depends where you are, with what unit you are with, and the proverbial fog of war still prevails here. So I think we should generally be a lot more modest in some of our statements that we are making about this conflict.
Well, and it's amazing how much we don't really know about what's happened or what's going on. RUSI has just published a fantastic paper on the nature of the air war, both in the early stages of the war, but also even now, and the prevailing wisdom that the Russian Air Force was not really having a lot of impact on the ground was dispelled to a great extent, I think, in this paper. They're flying a lot of sorties, in the initial days of the war, and having a lot of effect at shutting down Ukrainian air defenses. And then I think we're only now learning about the impact of cyber as well, and particularly the impact of the Viasat hack. There's a lot of controversy, some of it on the Ukrainian side are now saying, oh, well, that wasn't a big deal. Early on, they were saying this is a huge deal. Did you get any sense from talking to the Ukrainians about the impact on communications in the first days of the war? Because with Viasat, of course, they're able to shut down satellite communications, but there was also a lot of jamming going on against radio communications. Were they able to coordinate their units in that first week of the invasion?
So my impression has been, and again, this is really from a fairly narrow perspective here, and just talking to a few folks who were involved in the Battle of Kiev, that there wasn't really a command and control issue on the Ukrainian side as a result of Russian interference. I think there was just a command and control issue because of the chaos that is fairly normal in the first couple of days of any war, I suspect. And the Ukrainians generally had little problem getting communications in place. The problem was sometimes that they just didn't know whom to call, coordinate strikes and so forth. And a lot of it was, again, done relying on commercial products. So a lot of cell phones were used for targeting, for example. Pictures were taken where, geotags and so forth that were sent back to the rear to artillery strike teams and so forth. So I don't think there was a lot of Russian electronic warfare capabilities, for example, on the front line, which we now know is pretty much, fairly an accurate picture in the first couple of days of this conflict, and this changed, of course. But when it came to, some of the cyber attacks, I really didn't talk to many folks about this while I was over there. But there's good evidence now that it definitely disrupted Ukrainian command and control among some of the regular forces. To what degree, though, it really disrupted the communications of some of the volunteer forces, I'm not so sure about. And also, my understanding has really been that in the first couple of days, there was really little interference, at least when it came to some of the units fighting the Battle of Kiev from the Russian side. And I do think, and I think I remember we chatted about this a couple of months ago, where I actually asked you for, what your thoughts are on the whole cyber dimension of this conflict. And you said you're probably not going to make any public statements about it because this would be akin to talking about the Second World War in 1941 or something like that.
Drawing lessons from it, that's right.
Drawing lessons, right, from the Second World War in 1941, yeah, and I think that's a fairly accurate, statement, and we should keep that in mind, yeah, when talking about this stuff here.
Well, we'll keep that in mind, but on the other hand, you've just published a paper on what the lessons learned are from this conflict, particularly with regards to what Taiwan should learn from this conflict. It's a great paper in Foreign Policy magazine, 6 round lessons for Taiwan from the war in Ukraine. Encourage everyone to read it, but let's discuss that. So the first lesson you cite is that there are no game-changing weapons, and in this conflict there's been a lot of excitement on Twitter about TB2 drones, about these Mavic drones from China, and all sorts of nifty new tools like javelins that are popping up on the battlefield. But explain why you don't think any of them are really game-changing.
Well, I think weapon systems obviously have an important role. They're not game-changing because what we tend to forget, because I do think there's this notion of technological determinism in the West, and I think it is a problem, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well, of NATO and so forth. We tend to forget that what really drives military effectiveness is not the weapon system per se, but how we use it, how we operate it. Concepts of employment, concepts of operation. Is the right military doctrine in place to really guarantee that we use this weapon system most effectively? So I think for me the major point was here to move away from this technological explanation pertaining to military success to actually say, listen, there are other factors that sometimes are probably much more important than just having superior military technology. And there are countless examples in military history where this has been the case. So no, there are no Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, and I do think we would do very well to much more look at operational concepts, doctrine, and also force design, force structure, how we embed these weapon systems and platforms more effectively. And this is, I think, one of the lessons that I take from this conflict.
And one of the things that's pretty obvious now, and again, so much is still unknown, but that this has really been a war of artillery since day one, and that javelins and NLAWs and TB2s have had some effect, but certainly not decisive effect on any of the battlefields. Certainly not compared to the artillery on both that's been used on both sides. But the one weapon I think that has caused Russia tremendous problems, and the one that they still have not been able to develop a counter, because you have seen them trying to adapt to the drones, for example. The jamming has become a lot more effective. You're not seeing a lot of TB2 activity nowadays because the battlefield is smaller and the electronic warfare is becoming much more effective. But the HIMARS is something that they just have not been able to solve, the long-range artillery that the U.S. has provided to the Ukrainians. And it's really remarkable to me because you'd think that this is the military that's been so focused on the conflict with NATO, and that they, are an artillery-based military, the Russians are, and that they do not have an answer for an artillery system that the U.S. has had, since the 2000s. Were you surprised by that?
Yes, I was to a certain degree, but I think it also proves my point again. We tend to focus on HIMARS as a weapon system alone and disregard the fact that the Ukrainians were fairly effective in integrating this into an overall warfighting concept on the ground. That is, ISR capabilities that are necessary in order for HIMARS to do its job effectively, then come up with a good, really overall concept of operations where you focus on key enemy nodes, command and control nodes, supply depots, and so forth, and not waste your ammunition on targets that are really not as valuable. So I think it is has much more to do with the concept of employment, the operational concept behind it, military doctrine, than the platform itself. And I think this is the key lesson here. And again, of course, when we focus on just the system, we tend to disregard all the other stuff that makes it work. But yes, it was certainly surprising, also because generally speaking, when it comes to any military conflict, we have to think about it of it as a dialectical competition, so to speak. And at the technical level, one technical capability can usually quite easily be countered by another technical capability. I always like to cite the commander of the Reichswehr, the successor of the Imperial German Army after the First World War, Hans von Seeckt, who said, against a technical problem, there will always be a technical solution, so to speak. And he was talking about this hype in the 1920s surrounding air power and
the bomb will always get through, right?
It was the British Prime Minister scaring the British people and so forth. And there was this big hype in the United States, Great Britain, France, Italy, but not in Germany in the interwar years. I think this was largely driven by a more pragmatic approach of people like Hans von Seeckt. Of course, they completely got strategic bombing wrong, which also brings me back to drawing the wrong lessons. And there was, for example, a lot of confirmation bias at the time in the German Luftwaffe in the 1930s, drawing the wrong lessons from the Spanish Civil War, where because of the lack of large industrial targets, they thought that it confirmed their tactical air doctrine, and that they didn't really saw much utility in having a strategic air doctrine and so forth. But I mean, I'm digressing here. In any case, I think the HIMARS example really proves my point.
So the other lesson learned you cite in the article is that it's too early to say that defense will dominate the future great power war. What do you mean by that?
Well, there's this understanding among some analysts that we're really moving in a defense-dominant operational environment. That is where it's extremely much more difficult to attack than to defend. And I'm not talking about the usual 3-to-1 ratio that you need, for one person defending, you need 3 people attacking and so forth. But that generally we are entering a new age where the defense is going to be structurally more dominant, or the balance. I don't really like the term dominance, frankly. Maybe the balance is shifting towards the defense. And there's a good argument to be made around this proposition, mostly based on technological aspects. For example, the ubiquity of sensors in the modern battle space and so forth, that makes it extremely difficult for ground forces, at least, to mass and attack, to achieve tactical surprise and so forth. But
although the Ukrainians just did it in Kharkiv, right?
Right. And so to me, though, the lesson here is really too premature to draw any real conclusions, in particular when one looks at the difference between like a continental operational environment like you see in Ukraine at the moment and then the future maritime operational environment. I think one has to separate between the ground, air, and sea domains of warfare, of course, because they're different. The offense-defense balance is shifting depending on what domain we are talking about. But I do think you can make a fairly good argument based on technological capabilities that it's going to be very difficult in the future to achieve tactical surprise and attack. But there are all these other factors that are not part of that discussion then if we focus just on the technological level. For example, tactical surprise can be achieved, as we've seen in Ukraine, not so much because the other side is not capable of seeing what you're doing, because the Russians were fairly aware of the Ukrainian forces massing in the Kharkiv region, right? But because of some, outdated or very rigid command structure that really made it difficult for them to pass on that information, and military commandos apparently did not really know what to do with it. And also because the Ukrainians were fairly effective in their information warfare campaign, drawing forces into Kherson region, it was also too late to divert to regroup and push the Russian forces back to the Kharkiv region and so forth. So I think my major lesson here is that it's too early to really make a prediction about this, and then one has to be extremely careful about applying some of the lessons that we maybe draw from Ukraine and apply it to Taiwan, because those two cases will be extremely different. Having said all of that, I do think you can make a good argument that there is going to be a shifting balance towards the defense on a technical level and primarily pertaining to the ground domain.
But haven't we seen that balance shift really over the last 50 or 60 years? One of the things we've learned is that invasion of countries is really difficult. We learned that in Vietnam. We learned that in Iraq. You can invade, but then you have a counterinsurgency campaign that's really difficult to prevent. Afghanistan. Now Russia's learning that in Ukraine. You look at how quickly countries were invaded in World War II or even immediately post-World War II. And that started to shift in the 60s, 70s, and later on, right?
No, I think you can, you're absolutely right. If you go back to, the last 2 years of the First World War, this concept of combined arms operations was essentially invented because they were trying to break the deadlock. They were trying to somehow figure out how we can circumvent this, defensive dominant operational environment of the First World War, and they came up with a couple of innovative operational concepts, the Sturmtruppen, for example, in Germany and Austria-Hungary and so forth, where it was really much more about fairly surgical artillery strikes, followed by assault troops that were punching through the front line at very concentrated spots and so forth. And it was really about the effective integration of aerial reconnaissance with artillery and then ground forces, right? So classic combined arms maneuver. And in Ukraine, we really only have seen rudimentary elements of combined arms maneuver, right? We've seen it in some shape and form in the Kharkiv offensive, for example. We haven't really seen it on the Russian side so far fairly effectively applied at all. And I think, again, here, if we think about this concept that combined arms operations was really invented to break the deadlock of a defensive dominant operational environment, it's just too premature to make any judgments based on what we've seen in Ukraine, just because the one thing that was invented to counter this sort of operational environment has not really been properly applied in this conflict yet. So perhaps if the Ukrainians will get better over the next couple of months in executing combined arms operation, maybe the front line will even become more fluid. Of course, that's just one factor of many other factors. But again, going back to my argument, there are technical reasons or technical arguments why the defensive balance is going to shift, why this offense-defense balance is going to shift in the favor of the defense.
Now, one of the reasons we have not seen effective combined arms on either side, at least in regards to the air component, is because of the prevalence of air defense systems on both sides. They're extraordinarily effective. On the Ukrainian side, really prevented Russia from dominating the airspace. But similarly on the Ukrainian side, they're very much afraid of Russian air defense systems. They're extraordinarily effective. So it is interesting. There's probably no country that has the capability to suppress and destroy enemy air defenses like the United States, right? Even most of the European countries do not have the capability, maybe Israel to some extent, but that may be one of the lessons learned is the renewed importance of shutting down integrated air defenses. Although, even I would question how effective we would be at shutting down even Ukrainian air defenses if we were invading Ukraine. Obviously, we would be able to get the job done, but we'd probably lose quite a few planes doing that.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And one other aspect that I found particularly interesting when it comes to the war in Ukraine is also whether we should rethink our force structure to a certain degree if we assume that airspace is going to be contested in the future and that it's going to be extremely difficult to execute air campaigns in such an operational environment. Maybe we need to have a larger conversation about shifting some of our firepower from the air domain to the ground domain, for example. Here in the United States, the U.S. Army is already thinking through these problems, right? With its new force structure, where they really try to emphasize ground-based fires and so forth, not just in Europe but also in the Pacific, in the potential Pacific theater of operations in the near future. But to me, yes, maybe this is something that's going to stay around. having said that again, we sort of have known prior to the outbreak of this conflict that the Russian aerospace forces are not going to be such a huge factor in this conflict because, as we've seen also in Russian air operations in Syria, for example, we sort of could tell that some of their capabilities are fairly rudimentary, right? And so the idea that they would have been deployed in a way like NATO air power would be deployed in Ukraine was, of course, always sort of not something to take seriously.
The other lesson learned you cite in the article is that commercial off-the-shelf technology is unlikely to play an outsized role in a great power war. So why is that? I mean, you see Starlink actually having enormous advantage for the Ukrainians and becoming a really critical capability. You see them integrating some of these commercial drones very effectively for ISR. Why don't you think it will be more decisive in future wars?
Yeah, so I mean, I really am putting forward a fairly simple argument in that instance, essentially arguing that the reason why these capabilities have been exceptionally effective in Ukraine is because there are these safe havens in place that likely would not be in place in a great power war involving China, the United States, and Russia. That is, when we think about some of these capabilities that the United States and other Western countries are providing to Ukrainians, they're fairly secure supply chains that enable that. And in a great power war, these supply chains would be less secure, and you could really target also critical infrastructure supporting the delivery of these capabilities. So we talk about the cloud, but there are obviously somewhere servers that are storing all this data. So, if the Ukrainians are moving the government records outside of the country, in a war involving the United States, there would be no safe haven, right? And I think this is something that policymakers in the United States and other Western countries need to wrap their head around, right?
So right now, Russia has not targeted the satellites provided by Starlink with their anti-sat weapons, but they could if they're in a conflict with the United States or if we're in a conflict with China, right? So that would be a different situation.
Exactly. And I mean, I would be curious to hear your thoughts on the cyber dimension. Why haven't we seen wide-scale Russian cyber attacks disrupting some of these supply chains as well, right? It's just, at least from what we can tell, and there's probably a lot we can't really know at this stage, but to me that was also quite surprising because it would probably be less escalatory than kinetic strikes.
So, and this is your fourth lesson here, is you should not assume that cyber operations will only play a small role in the great power conflict, and I do agree with that. I have to say, I have been surprised that Russia has not responded more aggressively to sanctions and export controls that we've levied on them with cyber attacks, and I think the reason is that Putin has been very cautious about escalating vis-a-vis the West. And even, forget cyber, even on the economic sphere, he has not engaged in significant retaliatory actions. He has done the gas cutoffs, of course, to Europe, but there's so much he could have done on the critical minerals piece of it, titanium, aluminum, nickel, uranium, all of the things that Russia is a huge producer of. They have not cut it off. They could have, and they could have sustained that economically because really most of their revenues are coming from oil sales, not critical material sales. So I have been surprised that they've been so cautious about escalating, but I think they do fear even more NATO involvement in this conflict. They know that they're not doing well as it is. So the last thing they need is NATO getting more aggressive and providing more long-range weapons and other capabilities, potentially even, getting involved with air power, what have you. So I think that is a fear that they have that is deterring their actions, and frankly is deterring us as well, right? So as a friend of mine mentioned the other day, deterrence is messy, but it's actually working here. And the goal of deterrence is to prevent the other side from taking escalatory actions, and it affects us just like it affects Russia. And it's unpleasant because we don't like to be constrained, but when we think about the value of constraining Russia, we have to appreciate that part of that cost is constraining ourselves.
So cross-domain deterrence actually works in this case.
To some extent, yes. There are limits, but for sure. But on cyber operations, I think that again, there's so much we don't know about what the Russians have done. But when I look at the potential conflict with Taiwan or over Taiwan, and assuming that there's going to be U.S. involvement, it's very clear that there's going to be very different weapon systems that are going to be used. Much more networked platforms like the F-35, like some of our naval assets that are much more vulnerable to cyber operations, at least to disable them or to impact and degrade their capabilities, than the old Soviet military hardware that the Ukrainians are using. So there's not a whole lot you can do in cyber to a D-30 howitzer that doesn't even have a chip in it, much less a network connection. You could probably do more against some of the systems that we have provided, like HIMARS, that have over-the-air update capability, but even that's kind of limited. So it's certainly not as networked as most of the systems that the United States would use in a conflict with China that would present a much broader target set for cyber operations.
And I also believe in the case of a war over Taiwan involving the United States and China, China would of course be acutely aware of not wanting to vertically escalate such a conflict with the United States, and perhaps one could put forth an argument that this will make the use of offensive cyber capabilities even likelier. For example, targeting U.S. airfields in the region with massive cyber attacks, right? Shutting down essentially command and control capabilities and so forth. It would be less escalatory perhaps than hitting these bases with kinetic strikes, right? I mean,
I'm not sure it would be actually, because
okay. So
it might bring the U.S. Into the fight right away because of the fear that our capabilities would be degraded over time if we don't use them now. We would lose them. So, I think there's a big question of how China is going to think about Taiwanese invasion. Do they assume, and they would be probably correct to assume, that we would be involved either way? So they might as well go all out against Guam, against Okinawa, and other regional assets, both kinetically and through cyber, and not worry about escalation, just assuming that the U.S. will be brought into the fight anyway.
Oh, that's a fair argument, yeah.
So another lesson you cite here is that lighter, smaller, more mobile systems are unlikely to dominate the battle space in a future great power war. And that one, I think, is a little bit more controversial because this has been a very mobile fight, both between the Russians and the Ukrainians. A lot of loitering munitions that have been used, a lot of UAVs, but also a lot of smaller armored personnel carriers and the like. You have not seen really mass armor driving down the battlefield, except in the early stages of the war with the Russian famous attempt to take Kiev. But why do you think that this is a wrong lesson from this conflict?
Well, my basic argument here is that it's not either or. It's supposed to be both, right? So I'm really advocating a hybrid force structure when it comes to integrating lighter forces with more heavier weapon systems and capabilities. And I remember being in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, and we were a couple of miles away from the Kherson front line at a command post of the Ukrainian ground forces, and chatting with a Ukrainian soldier, and he essentially said, well, this war essentially is being fought or is dependent on three factors: artillery. So this is really a ground-based fires war, so to speak. It's really primarily driven by heavy artillery fire.
It's amazing how much this is like World War I. Guys sitting in trenches lobbing artillery at each other, right?
Well, the difference, though, is that there are actually capabilities that could potentially break that deadlock, right? And I think there's a completely different, separate debate that needs to be had, about the space forces ratios in this war. It's a tremendously long front line, thinly manned overall, and I do think this is another factor that we need to be very conscious of, in particular when we talk about war over Taiwan. The geography is just so markedly different. This is a continental operational environment. Maritime operational environment will be very different, and will have many different lessons to learn when it comes to applying all of this to this conflict in Asia, right? But my argument here is essentially that this is really more of a default solution on the Ukrainian side, that is using these lighter armed forces to advance and conduct offensive operations. It's not really their preferred choice. Their preferred choice would really be main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, really much more protected mobility. So this is really much more a choice of necessity rather than something that they would really...
they just don't have enough of them.
They just don't have enough of these capabilities. And I think it is a conversation, an ongoing conversation. I'm not saying that at some point there will be a replacement for the main battle tank. I do think there are sunk costs involved. There are opportunity costs also because there's a huge supply chain behind any of these heavy formations, and there are also ways around it, right? How you can make these heavier formations more effective. You don't necessarily need to destroy tanks, but you just destroy the supply chain, and these tanks fairly quickly become ineffective. Then, of course, also...
But that's not new. I mean, that's World War II.
Was right, exactly. I mean, if they, once you lose the Romanian oil fields, blitzkrieg is essentially, gone. If you don't have, your logistics behind it. But I think...
I mean, the best argument I heard from a tank was from our mutual friend, Michael Kaufman, who said, if you're in infantry and you have to assault a fortified position, do you want to be in a tank or not? And that's a pretty simple choice, right?
That is true. And I do, one argument would be, it would probably be true if you are, at the range of 1,000 to 3,000 meters, vis-a-vis the front line. But what about, how do you get to this, effective operational range of the tank, right? There's 40 kilometers or whatever where you're fairly exposed unless you really operate in a combined arms fashion, and also bigger targets attract are more likely to attract precision fires, right? So I don't know whether the lesson here is that clear cut. My argument is that we need both in the likely future, a more hybrid force structure that involves both elements and effectively integrates both.
So your last lesson from the article is a really interesting one, that no, Ukraine is not winning because it fights like us. There's been a lot of patting ourselves on the back in this conflict from many current and former military personnel. They're saying, well, because we've been training Ukrainians into NATO way of fighting since 2014, this is really why they're winning. And you say that's not true.
Yes, and I think this is probably the most dangerous lesson to be taken from this conflict. That is, they're winning because they fight like us. Because it invites essentially intellectual self-complacency, and that's always a mistake. War is essentially always a dialectical competition, and once you think you figured it out, you're likely going to be proven wrong in the long run. So I'm really in favor of constantly re-examining our attitudes when it comes to these as objectively as possible, draw the right lessons, really viciously re-examine every single one of our doctrines, our concepts, and so forth. Because if you look at what has really happened over the last couple of months in Ukraine, particularly when you go back to how we started this conversation, the Battle of Kiev, this battle was, from my understanding, by and large decided by volunteer forces who threw themselves in a fairly uncoordinated fashion against the enemy. A lot of these people didn't really have much training. They didn't have NATO training. What people told me is that they were actually Googling how to use some of these weapon systems that they got from depots, weapons depots, and so forth. And this did not have anything to do with NATO training, really. And some of the analysts have also pointed out that NATO military instructors actually learned a lot more over the years from Ukrainians than the other way around, because they have been fighting this war since 2014. They know much better how to fight the Russians than we do at this stage, I think. And
some of the lessons are not applicable. NATO likes to fight with full air cover, right, and dominance of the air battlefield. So having both those lessons applied to Ukraine doesn't make a lot of sense, because that's not the environment they fight in. But also, the reverse is not true. That here you have Ukrainian fighter pilots, as one example, flying at 100 feet above the surface, which you really wouldn't have NATO pilots doing anyway. So this is just there are limits to learning lessons in this conflict for both sides.
Right, and for example, the other important thing here is, what I always hear is, well, they have an NCO core, and it's the force structure also that's been adopted to NATO standards, or is in the process of being adopted to NATO standards and so forth. And there's very little evidence that this is really the case. There's been some confusion between a proper NCO core and just a lot of enlisted personnel with a lot of fighting experience, because they've been in battle since 2014, for example. There are major issues in terms of payment, retention rates, and so forth. And I have not seen a lot of evidence that there is actually an effective Ukrainian non-commissioned officer corps similar to what we have in the West, right? Also, when it comes to our command philosophies, mission command, for example, this idea that you have a commander's intent, and from that you make up your own plans, but it's a fairly decentralized planning process where you essentially come up with a way of executing your commander's intent. I think that's also sort of a mistaken assumption. And you're confusing here really this ad hoc attitude or military planning process in Ukraine with mission command philosophy, and I think it invites also friction in a way that probably would not be the case in NATO force at this level, right? So that means that there's a lot of maybe uncoordinated action between battalions, brigades, and so forth. And I think it's very difficult sometimes to deconflict these operations. But again, it works, and it's always when we talk about military power, it's always, of course, relative. So if the stuff that I saw on the Ukrainian side, and if I was not really convinced by some of the things that I saw how they were executing the operations, it likely is a lot worse on the Russian side at this stage.
So this article says, it's titled 6 Wrong Lessons. You did not write the article 6 Right Lessons, but I think probably the biggest lesson that we can extract for Taiwan from this conflict is the importance of Poland, right? If we weren't able to resupply Ukraine with weapon systems, with ammunition, Ukrainians would be in a lot of trouble, right? And Taiwan is an island, and resupplying it would be extraordinarily challenging in the face of a Chinese blockade and being so close to the mainland, being able to establish a contested airspace over the island. Let's switch from Ukraine to Taiwan for a second here, but how do we solve that problem? Because eventually Taiwanese are going to run out of everything, not just ammunition, but food, energy. Much of it is imported into the island. This seems like the biggest vulnerability, because the other lesson from this conflict is that great power wars can last a long time, that they may not end in a few weeks or even a few months. And if a conflict over Taiwan lasts a long time, the Taiwanese are going to be in a world of hurt, not just their military, but even the civilian population.
Yes, and I've always said that I really would like to see a war game that sort of is gaming through a Sino-U.S. war over Taiwan at day 60 or 70, after precision ammunition stocks have been depleted, after enormous casualties have probably been incurred by both sides already, because I think one of the major lessons also from this war in Ukraine, to not switch from wrong lessons to lessons, is I think the fact that, yes, your forces are going to be depleted quite quickly. Probably your best formations are going to suffer disproportionately more in terms of casualties and loss in materiel than other formations. So I think one of the lessons that I draw from this is just the ability to quickly regenerate your forces. What can you do to do that? What structure can you set up in peacetime to guarantee that this is going to happen? So I think we probably need to have much more conversations about the structure of our reserve forces in Western militaries. How can we really come up with a more comprehensive approach also in terms of our defense industrial base that enables this force regeneration, just in terms of also supplying our forces with munition and so forth in a sufficient manner. But I think what you said was right on the money. This problem is really very tricky to solve in terms of supplying Taiwan with capabilities, with ammunitions and so forth prior to the outbreak of a conflict, prior to the imposition of a blockade. And I don't think there's a right or wrong answer at this stage how to do this. I mean, the obvious answer would be we should just ship all of this stuff in peacetime to them, and then they should stock up massively their supplies. I don't know whether that's really a possibility though at this stage, because I think we also need to be carefully managing the relationship between Taiwan and China, and
Well, I think one of the answers, at least on the ammunition side, is that they need to invest in their own domestic production of small arms, of their own. They have domestic anti-ship missile capabilities, and they need to ramp it up dramatically, and they need to harden it, probably bring it underground into the mountains where it can be destroyed through missile strikes and the like.
But I'm very skeptical that any country at this time is actually capable to produce the amount necessary.
Do you think China can?
It's interesting, in the case of China, they're not really producing precision-guided munitions, short-range ballistic missiles, and so forth, at least from what we can tell, at such a scale that they would actually be capable of sustaining a prolonged fight over Taiwan, which I find is also interesting, which again makes me also think, what other capabilities do they think they can apply?
Well, maybe like Russia, they think that this can be a quick war.
Well, usually most big powers think that when they engage in conflict, it's likely going to be quick and fairly bloodless. And time and again, history has proven otherwise. But maybe that's one explanation. But I do think that not even China at this stage has the capacity to really quickly replenish its arsenals in the event of a high intensity conflict. So I don't know whether you can actually do that. In terms of, in relative terms in Taiwan, because of course overall China will have much more capacity to ramp up production than Taiwan. And in Taiwan, they're going to run out sooner or later of precision-guided munitions and other stuff. I mean, there's just no way around it. So I think this needs to be factored in. And so again, I have to move away from the technical aspect of this discussion to say, okay, Taiwan also needs to come up with additional innovative operational concepts that factors this in order to really project the deterrence by denial posture. And technical solutions or additional munition is one part of the equation, but there are also other aspects that will be very important here.
The other lesson here is that the Russians, despite their attempts to shut down communications on the battlefield with the Viasat hack and jamming operations, really have not made a concerted effort, even till now, to destroy Ukrainian communications, target their telecommunications infrastructure, and internet cables and the like. That would be extraordinarily easy for the Chinese to do in the case of Taiwan. Much of their communications come through undersea cables going to the island. They can be cut. Jamming can be very effective given the proximity to the mainland. And that's something that I think we're not paying enough attention to, because probably one of the biggest assets that the Ukrainians have had was the ability to put out Zelensky on TV every night with a message not just to his people but to the world, talking about the atrocities that the Russians are committing, mobilizing world opinion in support of Ukraine. If you can't do that in Taiwan, if you can't get the message out, or it's very difficult, or it's even difficult to coordinate with U.S. forces, that would be an enormous Chinese advantage.
You're absolutely right. And the center of gravity in many ways in this conflict in Ukraine is really Western public opinion and how to influence Western policymakers. And the Ukrainians were exceptionally well tailored in terms of their messaging to Western policymakers. If you would have told me, or if I would have told you a year ago that one of the largest counteroffensives in this war was really spearheaded by German anti-aircraft tanks, or whatever you want to call these Gepards, right? In a war against Russia, you would have called me crazy. The fact that Germany is actually delivering military hardware to a country at war. This is a watershed event in German post-war history, for example, right?
Well, the Ukrainians are complaining that it's not enough. It's
not
late,
enough, but they're also, I mean, if you talk to the people who actually know what's going on the ground, the Gepard is doing a really great job. And of course, it's never enough in a war like this where you have, platform systems knocked out on a daily basis and so forth. We just can't keep up with, replenishing, their losses, of course. But this, again, there are structural factors here involved that go beyond the politics of not wanting to deliver these capabilities. I think and this is actually sort of the beef that I have with some of the U.S. operational concepts and, thinking about future conflict surrounding Taiwan, is really this information dimension, or at least this idea that when you talk about, or when you look at concepts such as the U.S. Army's new multi-domain operational doctrine and so forth, and its idea that you need to be able to achieve cognitive dominance over your adversary, I think it's going to be extremely difficult in the war against China to achieve this. And I think one of the wrong lessons here is also from Ukraine, probably, that it's fairly easy to operate in a non-permissive environment where you actually do have access to information and where you actually can conduct the command and control without really much interference from the cyber dimension or electronic warfare capabilities or the entire electromagnetic spectrum, so to speak. So I would be very, very interested in how the U.S. military is actually thinking about some of these issues. And it's a big concern to me that maybe we are drawing the wrong lessons here again when it comes to the ability of U.S. armed forces in the war over Taiwan to achieve information superiority or an information advantage over your adversary. Because frankly, what I missed in a lot of these doctrinal discussions in the United States is, what about if this is not going to be the case? What about if we can't really achieve cognitive dominance or like information superiority or an information advantage in a war against China? What do military commanders then do? Do we automatically switch to some sort of, symmetric attritional response? Is there any other way how to do it? Doctrine is not really indicative here, or doesn't really suggest another course of actions. I think this is something we need to be careful about when we think about how the United States would potentially fight China over Taiwan. And I think the information dimension here is something to keep an eye on.
In other words, every domain may be contested.
Exactly, yeah.
Franz-Stefan Gady, thank you so much for joining us. Fascinating discussion. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me.